All right, so the first 2 minutes of audio had a problem, so I'm just going to do a quick overdub. In this talk, I'm going to get into how to use models to deal with just the overwhelming size of the scientific literature. And I'm going to talk about using models in a couple different ways, but just to illustrate how the literature can be overwhelming, just let's consider one small bit of the brain, the hippocampus. And if you get on Google Scholar and type in hippocampus, you're going to get over 2 million hits. And so that's just not human readable in anyone's lifetime. Even if you restrict the search to say the last year, you're still going to get 38,000 hits. And so if you feel like you're getting overwhelmed and the scientific literature is just increasing and increasing every year, that's because it is. So the scientific literature is literally exponentially increasing at a rate of about 3% a year. And this has consequences. So, like disruptive findings, potentially disruptive findings are just getting lost in this deluge. And so, science isn't advancing as much as it should. And of course, it's worse yet, right? Because neuroscientists don't study one brain area, but the interactions of many areas. And if one is doing interdisciplinary research, the challenge is just, multiplied yet further. Okay, so I'm going to, in this talk, discuss about using models in complementary ways, both process models that are more theoretical models and models as analysis tools to help with prediction. And I'll get into the BrainGPT project. And so I think right about now in the live talk, people told me the audio was completely messed up. So I think now I could hand you off to me in the past. Enjoy the talk.
Okay. And wrapping up the talk, sorry, online people, just to catch you up really briefly, science is hard. We do a lot of it. We can't keep up. And we're going to use models to make that a bit easier. So don't worry, if you saw the slides, you probably got the main point. And so again, we're going to have these two types of models, process models, which are more theoretical models that do the behavior, the task of interest. And so they're more explanatory. And then in the second part of the talk, I'll talk about models as analysis tools, and I'll touch on the BrainGPT project. So this is really using models for prediction. And these two types of models play complementary roles, again, namely explanation and prediction. And to help illustrate this, here's an image from this brain score from Jim DiCarlo's lab. And these are models being scored for how good they are at accounting for object recognition in terms of brain response and behavior. So even though these models came from engineering, these are really process theoretical models because they do the behavior, they do the task of object recognition. They're evaluated in terms of how well they account for brain response and behavior. So these are process models. Now, you could have models that are just analysis tools. So here's a slide illustrating mind reading or stimulus decoding. And here, a model, it could also be an artificial neural network, is applied to some voxels. And we're just trying to determine, is the subject looking at a shoe or a cat? So even though, this seems similar to the models on the left, it's not. It's just an analysis tool. It's not a model of how people recognize shoes or anything. It's just really characterizing the information available in those voxels. So in the first part of the talk, let me discuss process models first, these more theoretical models, and how they could help make sense of this wild literature. So, you might ask, why does neuroscience need process models? And so one use of these models is just really being clear on what we predict and why. You might say, oh, I know what I predict, but historically that's not really true. So if you take exemplar and prototype theory in categorization, in exemplar theory, every experience leaves a trace in memory. It's independent. In prototype theory, all these traces are stored as like one node or cluster in memory. And a lot of findings, behavioral findings, were thought to require a prototype representation. But once these models were formalized, that was shown not to be the case. And of course, once we formalize these models, we could do model comparisons, and not just on behavior, but on brain response. So here's an old example where we did this. Instead of stimulus decoding or mind reading, we did model decoding to see which model was most consistent with brain response. And of course, models can assist in data analysis. So once you select a model, you could use it as people do in representational similarity analysis. The model might predict some patterns of similarity across stimuli. You could see where in the brain is in accord with that. And most germane to today's talk is I really think process models can provide a compression of the vast scientific literature. So just use an example, think of like the Rescola-Wagner model of classical conditioning. It's a really simple model. It's not the best model, but if you understood that, you'd understand a lot about experiments in that field, maybe hundreds of experiments from the simple model. So I kind of think of it as this lossy compression that could help you order and make sense of things. So I'm going to try to push that case with an example in my own domain. Again, there's all kinds of models, but one nice thing about process models is that they do the behavior and they have components that can be related to brain measures. So they really are a bridge between brain and behavior. Let me talk about an example of a process model in my own domain. And I want to take this model on this journey from accounting for behavior to brain to even trying to get down to something more like cellular. And so here, this is going to be a learning model, a model of categorization. And so this is a clustering model, and we're joining the model partway through its learning. And it has this cluster up top of mammals with the M that are big and don't have wings, and this cluster of birds that are smaller and have wings. And it sees this creature, and it's most similar to the bird cluster. So the model will predict it's a bird and update it to reflect its newest member. So it's just going to move towards its newest member. So far, it's like a prototype model. It's kind of like a pattern integration operation. But if we get a surprising error, so this creature is small, it has wings, it flies, but surprise, bats are mammals, so it has to be pattern separated, and the new cluster is incrementally recruited. So this is a really simple model, but it's done a great job of accounting for behavior. And decades ago, Tigrex and I were thinking, what does it have to do with the brain? And these kinds of clustering operations seem to graft on well to what the hippocampus does. And so we modeled different populations that varied in function and the hippocampus, and it worked well. And then later on, working with Ali Preston and Tyler Davis, we used this simple clustering models and model-based fMRI to characterize the time course of learning. And it did a good job of characterizing what the hippocampus was doing. And in subsequent work, looked at how different contexts or tasks could affect the clustering. So you take the same set of stimuli, but you organize them into different categories. You'll get different clustering, which will imply different patterns of neurosimilarity. And those patterns were found in the hippocampus. Later work looked at the intrinsic dimensionality of the bullet response. So these models, sometimes they'll say you have to pay attention to more aspects of the stimuli, sometimes fewer. And you could see the dimensionality of the signal and the brain changing in visual cortex. And then finally, we looked at like how you even figure out what's relevant during learning in this model. And that really well corresponded with what was going on in VMPFC. So it's a really simple model, but it's able to address like all these different brain regions and what they might be doing. And it's naturally go further even and think about spatial concepts. So there's really a common idea, I think, that these kind of higher level concepts, maybe that people think I'm studying, that they're grounded in space, but maybe that's not true. Maybe instead there's just one general learning mechanism that rules them all, and that's all there is. And so we try to test this idea if we could use these same simple clustering models to explain things like place and grid cells. So here's a video of a rodent in this open enclosure. And if this were, every time the neuron being recorded from flyers, it's just leaving a little white mark on the screen. So if this were a place cell, which we kind of think of as like the clusters in our models, it would only fire at one location, ideally, but that's not what's going on here, right? It's firing at all these different locations, and that's because it's a grid cell, kind of a stereotypical one. And you could see this kind of six-fold symmetry arising if you just kind of count out from one of the central clumps of spikes firing. So can we explain how you see stuff like this in the brain with these simple clustering models? Just the same kind of mechanism. And one insight that Rob Mock had that was doing this work is that when you're in a typical cognitive domain, it tends to be higher dimensional and things are very clumpy and sparse. So you don't observe all combinations of all features. So for example, we don't have elephants with wings and so forth. Whereas if you're in a really simple like rodent experiment and you're in this enclosure and you're kind of just sampling every combination of everything, every possible viewpoint. It's effectively a two-dimensional space. And so you could see the kind of clustering you would get from there. It's going to end up being this hexagonal grid pattern, and in this case, kind of this degenerative clustering solution. And again, we think of the clusters as like more like place cells, but you could see if they're organized this way, it's going to allow us to predict a grid response because something has to monitor cluster match, kind of like an inverse error term. And if the clusters are organized in that kind of grid, then that's going to be your grid cell, whatever's monitoring them. And that's not going to happen in other domains like your typical cognitive domain where things are clumpier. So this is a really simple model, but did a good job of explaining when and when not and to what extent you get a grid cell response. But there's really an explanatory gap there. So, this cognitive models are very high level. You only have a few clusters, but then there's very many, say, like place cells. And we just kind of wave our hands and say, well, there's a bunch of them, and they somehow coordinate to give rise to this like higher level cognitive construct, but that doesn't really answer the question. So with Rob, again, we took this level of mechanisms approach, which you could do with these kind of process models. And the top level here you could think of as behavior. The next level down is like the first level of mechanism. So that's just like the simple model I showed you. And so we could take a component of that mechanism, it's like say the clustering, we could decompose it into something lower level, like say something more at the level of a unit of a neuron. So instead of having these constructs, higher level construct like a cluster, we could have just thousands of cells. It still doesn't, of course, explain how they coordinate to give rise to that higher level cluster. And so I started thinking about that and thinking about how nature solves coordination problems. And so you get this flocking behavior in nature. So for example, birds flock, schools of fish flock. And so like, why couldn't neurons flock? Just to give one more example, in A-life simulations, these little bots flock. And so there's no central controller here. They're just following little local rules like match the heading of your nearest neighbor. But that gives rise to like kind of these like virtual clusters or flocks. So like, why can't we have a little learning rule so that neurons could do this to give rise to something higher level? So that's what we did. And if you remember at the beginning of the talk, I discussed like, oh, there's this bird, and then you update the cluster and it moves towards it. So the most active units move towards the current stimulus adjusted receptive fields. So we have that same learning rule going on now, except for instead of having just one cluster, you might have thousands of highly active units because now they're more at like a neuron level. And so that still happens, but to do the coordination, the flocking, all we need is a second learning update where they also move towards each other. So basically highly active things just adjust to be more like each other. And that's really simple, but all you need to do to get flocking. And so how could that be implemented? That could be implemented through internal recurrence in the hippocampus or so-called big loop recurrence, where you recirculate the output through entorhinal cortex back as an input. So you could basically recode the stimulus in terms of the most active units, and that would be sufficient to implement this flocking. Here's a simulation of what flocking looks like for a rodent moving around an enclosure. Now, it looks like we started out with thousands of units. It looks like they all disappeared. They did, and they just ended up flocking so tightly on top of each other that they just look like, like one little cluster. So it works, and it allows us to kind of explain all these phenomenon we saw before with grid cell responses and so forth. But now we don't have these higher level constructs. We've decomposed them into something more neuron-like. And we could go farther and look at how people learn concepts using the same model. So this is a simulation of a really simple learning problem with just two categories, and there's only like one flock or cluster in each one. So this problem is called Shepard-Hovland and Jenkins type 1 problem. It's really easy for people to learn. It's probably hard for you to see, and the details don't matter, but there's 5 other learning problems, and they just get harder basically as you go up in number from 1 through 6. And here's the behavior on the left there, and the vertical axis is the error rate, and the horizontal axis is the learning blocks. And the basic finding is just type 1 is the easiest to learn, then 2, 3, 4, and 5 are about the same, and type 6 is really hard. This is a hard pattern of behavior for cognitive models to capture, but we captured it on the right there in this model that doesn't even really have cognitive constructs. It just has this, like all these thousands of neuron-like units flocking. And what's nice is that we really have decomposed the higher level model. So if the higher level model, the old clustering model, would say have 4 clusters, this thing will have 4 flocks. But you could make more predictions. So you could say, like, why do you need so many neurons? And, so neurons are noisy, sometimes they die and so forth. And That doesn't really matter when you have thousands of them because the flock isn't defined by one member. So we could kind of make additional predictions. And just to take this one step further before wrapping up this part of the talk, you can always decompose farther. So far what we've done is we decompose this higher level construct of a cluster into these many units, but of course we could decompose those units again into say 2 banks because we know there's differences in the hippocampus along the anterior posterior axis. Place fields in the anterior tend to be broader, they're narrow in the posterior. Accordingly, if you have a really simple rule in a concept learning task, it tends to be more interior, where if you have something that has irregularities like kind of the bats, that tends to be more posterior. So we just separated that one bank of units into 2. So it's like another level of decomposition for interior, posterior. And we can naturally pick up these effects by just having the receptive fields have different broadness, dispersion. Okay, so in that part of the talk, we basically were able to decompose this higher level model by using this flocking. And the trick there was just 2 updates. One, yes, towards the stimulus for all these units, but the second towards each other. And that solved the coordination problem. What I really wanted to underscore in this talk is that we started with this really simple cognitive model. It might be hard to remember now. That was just accounting for behavior. I mean, it's literally something I made last century. And I started thinking about what does this do with the brain? Organized a bunch of patient data, used it in model-based fMRI, use it to try to explain spatial concepts, now even trying to get down to something lower level. And so I think it's a good example how you can have a nice explanatory model that links a bunch of different phenomena that's actually fairly simple and maybe makes the literature somewhat more tractable. Okay, but of course that's not going to be the solution to everything because we've had these kind of models for decades, and we're still feeling overwhelmed by the scientific literature. Findings are still getting lost. So probably not enough alone just to have these process models, which are great and explanatory, but maybe we need some useful tools as well that could play a complementary role, as you'll see. So now pivot to this BrainGPT part of the talk, where we're going to look at using models not as instantiating theories, being explanatory, but we look at them as use them as tools. And so this is going on in other areas of science. So you've all probably heard of AlphaFold from DeepMind that automates aspects of protein folding and makes good predictions. People are using deep learning in material sciences and drug discovery really everywhere. So I mean, what about neuroscience? Do we just use like ChatGPT type model? I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but these models actually are trained on a lot of the scientific literature. And so it's possible, as we'll see later in this talk, to specialize the models, say for neuroscience, with some additional tuning or training. But of course, they have problems, and you all know the problems. This is from the early days when ChatGPT was released. Someone's writing this mathematician on then Twitter. I couldn't find this paper of yours. What's the deal? And it's like, of course, it was just made up by the model. So people call that hallucinate. Maybe it should be called confabulate or but so there are weaknesses of these models, so we're going to consider ways of avoiding them. So all these models, these large language models, are powered by transformers, which are like the workhorse of machine learning these days. They're sequence-to-sequence models, and they're self-supervised, at least for the base model. So for example, in text applications, you just predict the next word in the sequence, but it could be anything. It could be the genome. It could be predict the next entry there. They really just have technical advantages over previous recurrent networks, especially in terms of the ease of training them. They've got these self-attention and fully connected layers in each transformer block. So the fully connected layers are like your standard neural networks. And I kind of think of them as being useful for storing the knowledge. The self-attention is really figuring out the relevancy of the sequences. So for example, if the model's been trained and it's working correctly, if it gets a sentence like, the monkey ate that banana because it was too hungry. So like, what does it refer to? The self-attention layer, if it's been trained right, will realize, well, monkeys must be the it because bananas don't get hungry, monkeys do. So it could kind of resolve that ambiguity. Okay, so these are everywhere, and we're going to be considering whether they could help us make predictions in neuroscience today. So you might have come across related efforts in the past. So like Meta released this Galactica model, and it was pulled after 3 days because it was accused of spreading misinformation. So this is being used in a way that we're not going to use these models to summarize the literature. And again, it has these issues of confabulation, hallucination, of just kind of making up stuff. And, but I think where transformers excel, this is like something I typed in just when ChatGPT came out, just having it do something novel, like generalized basically. So I just asked it to write this really simple Python program to do things way more complicated than this. And it did it correctly because it's been trained on code and it can generalize its knowledge effectively. And so why couldn't we have a model, like a generative model of the entire neuroscience literature that we could train on all our papers, experimental protocols, maybe even someday the raw data we have. And if we had such a model, I mean, we could do all the, call it like BrainGPT or something. We could do all the things we do now, but better. When people do power analysis, but we could also do design optimization. Like what would be the best way for me to design this experiment? What if I change this fMRI study to MEG study? What difference would that make? We could really evaluate how informative results are, like how surprising were the results of this experiment, identify outlier studies, either because they're breakthroughs or they contain some error. And, as a model, like I would like them because, I fit some particular data set and I make predictions that aren't tested yet. But now I could say, oh, look, those predictions this model makes are generally, in accord with the broader literature using something like this generative model of the whole scientific literature. Okay, so there are kind of previous efforts using language technologies like neuroscience, but they just really didn't take advantage of these advances in machine learning. And I've been talking about these people for their next version about actually powering it with this BrainGPT model. I'll show it later. Okay, so of course this is like a nice vision, but how do we know if we're on the right track and the models actually know anything about neuroscience? So we need some kind of benchmark to evaluate how good the models are. And in other fields like in computer vision, benchmarks have been incredibly important. This is how we got the deep learning revolution with AlexNet, because we could objectively see on this benchmark it did better and better and better. So we need a benchmark for neuroscience, and we want it to be a different kind. So most benchmarks in machine learning are backward looking. So it could be something like confirming a fact, like what year was the Gettysburg Address? Or it could be even in science, like question answering. There's like a little bit of reasoning, but there's usually like just a correct, objectively correct answer. But I actually want to focus on, given the shortcomings of these large language models, like we talked about a confabulation and hallucination, is to focus not on the past or summarization, which is really important for all this sort of information overload. But everyone's working on that. Instead, we're going to focus on this other aspect, more forward-looking predictive aspects we could use these models for. So that's kind of illustrated in this right panel, where you have two people playing table tennis, and now you're being asked, who's likely to win the next set. So, that's not really like, you could be right or wrong because someone's going to win or lose, but you're not going to be 100%. In some sense, you have to use your knowledge to kind of do some forecasting. Okay, so to do this, kind of got this BrainGPT project together, and based on one tweet, fortunately got a lot of people interested that helped out, and thanks to anybody who has helped out here or has done the study that I'll talk about in a few moments. So we got like over a couple thousand signups and a lot of active volunteers on the Slack, and with just a little bit of money from Microsoft Research to get some GPU time, we were able to get a lot done in a short period of time. So let me just show you what the benchmark items look like. So we call the benchmark Brain Bench. And the idea is we took Journal of Neuroscience abstracts from 2023 after the cutoff for the training of all the large language models we're going to consider. And we only altered them to change the results, but to otherwise be coherent. So I could just read you a little snippet from this one abstract. People and machines saw the whole thing. So recognition centered on the ventral and medial parts of prefrontal cortex. So ventral and medial is the correct answer. The alternative would be dorsal and lateral. So, it's like linguistically fine, but it's just not the actual result of the experiment. So we changed the results, the abstracts to be coherent, and only to change the results, not the methods or the background or anything. And this took a lot of labor. So we had a bunch of co-authors make hundreds of these, and most of them were rejected and went through multiple rounds of quality control. So it's very labor intensive. We also did this with GPT-4. I won't really show the results there because we're going to need to make these benchmarks in the future very quickly and roll them out. And we can't spend months and have 50 people work on this every time we want to make a new benchmark. So this is like an experiment within the experiment to see if we could automate it for the most part. And it did a pretty good job. It was like a little bit lower quality, but I think, it could do the trick. And hopefully as these models get better, they'll be able to generate benchmarks for themselves in a way. Okay, so in BrainBench, we had 200 human-created test cases, and those are the ones I'm going to show you the results for. And then we had these 100 machine GPT-4 created cases. And they're taken from the Journal of Neuroscience. And fortunately, that journal has 5 subsections: developmental plasticity repair, cellular molecular, neurobiology of disease, system circuits, and behavioral cognitive. So we naturally have these 5 sort of subscores to the benchmark. And again, what we did to make an item is we took an abstract and we only altered the results to try to keep it coherent. Then we gave both versions to neuroscientists, and they had to rate which was the correct version and give their confidence in the decision. They also rated their expertise for that question, because neuroscience is a vast field and people aren't expert in every part of it. Excuse me. And then we gave these test cases to machines, so large language models. And there, what we did, we didn't go into chat mode with them, and I'll explain why in the question and answer, if that's of interest. We calculated the perplexity of each version of the abstract, which is really just how surprising the LLM finds the text passage. And we had the model choose the one that had the lower perplexity. So whichever passage was less surprising was the model's choice. The confidence of the model was calculated as taking the difference in perplexity between the 2 options, just the absolute value of that. Okay, so each human expert did 6 of the human-created test cases, 3 of the machine-created test cases, and 2 catch trials. So the catch trials are just there to make sure they're paying attention and we're knowledgeable. And so we had all kinds of other checks too. Are people going too quickly? We even had a question at the end, did you cheat and use Google? And some people did, and we're honest. And so after all the checks and quality controls to make sure we get people that are really doing the task and are qualified, we got 171 people remaining. We also had a question on each trial. Have you seen this abstract before? Like maybe they actually read the paper. Some people might still read. And so there's only 24 trials that were excluded that way. But we ended up with a lot of data still. And here's a drum roll of the results. So the human experts are shown by this blue dashed line, which is like 63%. And you can see the machines just completely crush people. So the machines are up at 80-some%. It's just not even close. And it's across all these different model families. So we have Galactica that I mentioned before, Falcon, which comes from the Middle East, Llama 2 from Meta, Mistral from France. Yeah, they're all just pretty much way better. The slashes on the bars are for instruct models. So when you train these models just to predict the next word, that's called a base model. And you can't actually talk with it because it won't be polite to you or cooperative. And so people do this extra training on top to make instructor chat versions. And you can see it most clearly with the Mistral one, because there's only 2 bars there, that when you try to make the model basically more conversant with people, it performs slightly worse on the benchmark. Okay, here's the demographics of the human experts. So most people were PhD students, postdocs, or professors. And everyone did the same. I mean, graduate students did a little bit worse, but that's fine. I guess, PhD pays off. There's no statistical tests of these, so that's just a joke. PhD does not fail, actually. Okay. And we can also break down accuracy by area of neuroscience. So again, Journal of Neuroscience has these 5 domains. Behavioral cognitive is overrepresented within the Journal of Neuroscience. It's overrepresented within our BrainBench benchmark. 37% of the items are there. And so this spider plot is just showing you, here's people in the center, their accuracy across these 5 subsections. And the large language models just really, dominate everything. So it's not like people are better at something. They're just completely dominated by the LLMs in this task. Whoops. Okay, so we kind of want to try to understand, why are the LLMs so good at this? Are they doing anything interesting? And so we thought, well, abstracts naturally have the structure of a background, method, and results, and we only change the results. What if we just pulled out a sentence from the results section in isolation that had a choice? If the models are integrating information across the abstract, like information in the methods, they should perform worse, like if they're doing something non-trivial. And that was true. So that was kind of reassuring that something non-trivial is going on. So these higher purple marks are the original performance levels of the models that I showed you, around 80%. And when we just have the models strip the context away and just give the question, basically, which you could still answer, it's going to say, just the result. In isolation, the models do a lot worse. They drop down to those red dots. Okay. So of course, for this to be a forward-looking benchmark about prediction, it has to be that the models haven't just memorized all the test questions. So you want to do some checks for that. So again, these models were all, LLMs were all, their training stopped before 2023, where our test cases came from. There's always possible there's some precursor in the training sets. And so we use this method for machine learning people use to test for memorization of passages in large language models. And how it works is there's basically two numbers you calculate, and they're shown here on the two axes. So maybe we just look at the center plot for llama 2. So one measure is shown on the vertical axis. That's just the standard measure of text compression. So that's independent of the training of the model. And the horizontal axis is just the perplexity I've told you about before. So that's a function of the model's training. So if it's been trained a lot in something, the passage should have low perplexity. So if you're high on the vertical axis and low on the horizontal axis, you're probably memorized. And so for fun, I put in this Gettysburg Address because I knew that would appear thousands of times on the internet and probably be in these training sets like hundreds of times. And you can see that's this triangle here all by itself that is clearly memorized. It's high on the vertical axis, and look how it's like, basically really low in perplexity. Whereas if we switch over to look at this Galactica model, we know what it was trained on, thankfully. And so if we plot items on top of each other that we know it was trained on and items that we know it wasn't, like it just came out in bioRxiv or something, they're like the same distribution as our test cases from brain events from purple. And so what's really going on in these models, I think the scientific literature, like it's not appearing a particular paper on the internet. It's appearing once or none or twice. And so these models are just forming a general pattern that's kind of storing all these together. And so that's why you're going to get actually confabulation or hallucination, but it's also why you're going to get good generalization because they're just basically like kind of trying to learn some kind of like schema of the literature. There's really no evidence here that they're memorizing any of these particular papers. Okay, so one thing that would be nice for the future is if people could team with these models to do things. I mean, here we'll focus on prediction, but there's a lot of things people and machines could do together. So Mark Stivers and collaborators had this paper where they took machine learning models and they showed you if you pair a machine learning model and a person, that together they were more accurate than either one alone, or two machines or two people. And because there's this complementary to them where the machines and the people kind of saw things differently, but they also were calibrated in their uncertainty. So like when one was certain, it could take over, and when the other's certain, the other one could take over using this sort of Bayesian integration idea. And so we could do that kind of thing with these large language models. This is showing how well calibrated people's and machines' predictions are. So people are in the upper left there, and the horizontal axis is confidence, the vertical axis is accuracy. And so you could see the more confident people and machines are, the more accurate they are. So they are calibrated decently. Furthermore, this is looking at how much agreement there is basically when they make mistakes between the machines and the people. And the simple story is a lot of numbers here, but all the orange there is high numbers, and those are just LLMs with each other. So they all correlate, their judgments correlate with each other. So they all find the same items difficult or easy pretty much. Whereas the people is that dark band at the bottom, that 0.16, 0.17 correlation with the models. So people basically see things a bit differently in their models. So the items people find easy, the machines find hard, and vice versa. I mean, it's positively correlated, but weakly. So that's great for creating a diverse team of people and machines. So that's the next thing we'll hopefully do. So finally, I just want to give an example that you can actually do some training of these models. So everything I've done so far, I've shown you, has just been using these pre-trained models that are publicly available. But can we actually train one model ourselves? And it might seem crazy given that these models can cost millions of dollars to train. But there are ways that make it affordable and possible even for academics. So one way of doing it is using this LoRa technique that I could go into more in the question and answer if people are interested. But the basic idea of it is you take one of these models that someone spent millions training, and that's the blue box there. So that's the pre-trained model. It could be like, in our case, we used Llama 2, which is the smaller model, which is still 7 billion parameters and would cost millions to train. And what you do is you freeze those weights and you train the second pathway for each matrix, but it's far fewer weights. So we actually only added, I think, 0.26% more weights to the model. And it's still like 18 million weights, but that's a lot less than 7 billion. And with this, we could just train it in like 40 hours on 4 GPUs. And so what we did is we used this orange pathway to like introduce more neuroscience knowledge into the model. So like here's the recipe. Somebody else does trains the base model. So that's where they spend the millions. And then we get 20 years of neuroscience research, which you'd think is a lot, but it's actually very little for training these models. It still takes modern computers and, hours and hours. So we take 20 years of neuroscience research, and then we do the LoRa fine-tuning, parameter-efficient fine-tuning with it on that orange pathway. And then out comes like, some model, we could call it BrainGPT or something. So we trained on not just abstracts, but full articles from PubMed, and there's just a ton of neuroscience journals, but also some science general journals like PNAS. We just use keywords neuroscience to pull out the neuroscience relevant articles. And this might not look like a lot, but the model did do significantly better, 3% better after fine tuning it. And you can just see it understands in its own way. But that's a really bad word to use in regards to these models. Here's the perplexity plotted before the fine tuning, this broad distribution. And you can see it really moved to the left. And we trained this model ourselves, so we know it wasn't trained on the BrainBench cases. We did not include 2023 in the training. It's basically the items just kind of make more sense to it in terms of its perplexity, and it performs better. Okay, so what we'd like to do now is, make this it's publicly available in that you could download this on Hugging Face to your own computer, and it's not so big that you couldn't run it, but that takes some effort. We'd like to find someone to host this so you could just, use it through the web, but you need to find some funds for that. Okay, so I guess what's next? So things have progressed a lot faster than we thought would be possible. So now I think it's, time we could go a bit deeper and maybe make some useful tools. So one thing that interests me is not just something practical, but using these models to understand the structure of our own field. So for example, we could change what we train the models on and see how it affects our performance on BrainBench, our benchmark. So for example, does training on review papers help? So that's just people's opinion, right? There's no new empirical finding there. Does that introduce bias, or does this expert opinion help the model do better? Should we weight the training by recency, citations, impact factors of the journal? So everyone has strong feelings about these things, including those, neighboring fields like, is psychology relevant? Is chemistry relevant? We could just basically test it, right, and see how it impacts the performance of the model on the benchmarks. We could give definitive answers, at least in terms of prediction. And of course, everything I've mentioned so far is really general to any knowledge-intensive field. So this could be used in chemistry, it could be used in any field. There's nothing special about what we did at all. Okay, so to summarize the BrainGPT part, so there is information overload, we can't keep up. And so what we really try to do here is draw on the strengths of large language models, which I think is their ability to integrate noisy signals like the scientific literature and generalize from them. And here we just talk about generalization in terms of prediction and avoid the weaknesses like summarizing things. And so we're avoiding this confabulation hallucination problem. And we found that for this prediction task, the LLM surpassed human experts. Yeah, so maybe we could have this generative model of everything in the future. Okay, so returning to this slide to start wrapping up. So we talked about these two types of models to tame the complexity of the neuroscience literature. And I started talking about process models and gave this example, this really simple clustering model that went from behavior to model-based fMRI to trying to understand spatial tasks to getting down to something more at the neuron level. And that provided a good, kind of compression in its own way of these literatures and a kind of like intuitive understanding and scientific explanation. And the second part, I talked about, using this predictive tool that's not a theory, it's not really science, but it could be useful to scientists in this BrainGPT project. And I see these different approaches playing complementary roles. And so one way I kind of see these models is that they, like BrainGPT, they predict everything, but they explain nothing, right? So I could foresee a future in which we have models that can predict basically everything so much better than we can, but that's not really a scientific explanation in itself. It could be useful for forming one or testing one. And so the complementary roles really are this explanation prediction. So for example, when it talks about this work with Rob Mock about trying to explain why not you get a grid cell response, you could imagine giving this to something like BrainGPT, and it could predict when and when not you get a grid cell response. But here's at least one explanation of why, and a mechanism being offered. And so that's not going to come out of just like the kind of work I showed you today with BrainGPT, but it might be really useful in kind of getting to these explanations. So really, the complementary roles, just like I said at the beginning of the talk, are explanation and prediction. And I think they could feed into each other, and they're not at odds. So let me acknowledge collaborators. So Kent really did the lion's share of the work, even though there's so many authors on the BrainGPT project. Achilles is a wonderful undergraduate that ran the actual study. In the beginning part of the talk with the cognitive modeling, Rob Mock featured in a lot of that work, as did others that I hope I acknowledged along the way. In the BrainGPT project, the preprint has tons of authors. So here's the contribution table. Unfortunately, can't go through everyone, but they're really helpful. And if you want to read that paper, here's an archive link, and you could get it through also like the braingpt.org website or my own if you want to take a look at it. And so I'll just thank you and take any questions you have.